Hello, magical people. My name is Luminix, and thank you so much for being here. In today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the notion of how and whether people grow. This topic was a suggestion from my friend Eric over at Talking with Famous People, who did a live stream of the same title just a few days ago. So the first place I want to start is I want to take a look at the word growth. Actually, though, before that, I want to get the very obvious point out of the way, which is that, yeah, obviously people grow. We all see examples of that around us all of the time. But I'd like to take a little bit closer look at the idea of growth. As is often the case, I find the natural world a good metaphor when trying to explain things. So, of course, I think when most people think of growth, usually the actual image that comes to mind is usually plants. And it's, you know, this notion of moving towards the sunlight and expansion and positivity and a greater goodness, in a sense, that you are growing towards something, that this idea of growth is very positive and infused and imbued with the idea of said growth being a positive and good thing to occur. And while that certainly can be the case, obviously, I think that it's also important to think or remember that growth isn't always beneficial to the organism. So you think, for example, the growth of a tumor or a cancer or a, since we were talking about plants, you think about the growth that comes from not having the right conditions and how it can still be growth, but that growth will be twisted in a way and will in some ways actually weaken the overall entity, even though growth is occurring. And so I think that this is really a much more nuanced rabbit hole of thought than I maybe thought it was going to be. And unfortunately, I don't think I saw that live stream, or if I did see it, I think maybe I got there later in the game when the conversation had already moved on to other topics. But I think that it is obvious, regardless of, well, no, let me say that again. I think that it is obvious that particularly if we include all aspects of what the word growth implies, then it is not only obvious that people grow, but it is inevitable that people grow. Having said that, the how part of the question is when things now come into play. Because, of course, growth can occur when there isn't a good balance of the essential elements needed for growth. But it can obviously happen more readily when the ideal conditions are met. And I think a lot of times we might think as humans that the most ideal conditions for growth would actually not include a lot of adversity. And in some ways that's true, and in some ways that's not. I think ideally, if we could walk the fine line of experiencing small challenges and adversities of that nature while not having massive adversities or traumas, then that's kind of like the sweet spot, right? And I feel like this is a very obvious thing to say, but like, say, for example, again, using plants as a metaphor, I came across this fact really pretty recently and just thought that this was really fascinating. And I think that this is an, again, plants often are good at supplying wisdom. But I was reading up on, for some reason, I was reading up on something about cannabis. I can't remember where exactly this rabbit hole started, but where it ended was in a comparison between indoor grown cannabis and outdoor grown cannabis. Now, obviously, in both cases, these are plants that are closely monitored and well tended to, and all of their needs are being met. And that includes, I know that even when people grow indoors, they will do things that will create a little bit of adversity. So they will turn on a fan, for example, which will help that plant to become a little bit stronger, because it will have to manage the adversity of having that unsettling wind, and it gets stronger as a result. However, what's most interesting is that the spectrum of live resins, I think it was, that are collected from both indoor and outdoor grown samples indicate that there is a difference. And I think that based on what we know about growing plants and how much work we've done, I think most people would probably kind of default to the notion that the plants grown indoors would be more ideal, because you can have so much more control over the ideal nature of the growing conditions. But in fact, what they found is that while both plants were equally potent and equally healthy by general metrics, there was a difference in what they had available to them. And it was basically that there was a narrower spectrum of whatever this chemical component was, and my apologies for not doing actual research on this. And the outdoor grown had a broad spectrum of this same thing. And I think that we can extrapolate that out to people as well. Well, it is true that to a certain point, having a certain measure of control and safety and access to good nutrition and care and attention, it is also true that we benefit in some way from being out in the world and from having things blow into our environment that wouldn't happen if we were always in a bubble. So sort of taking that notion, I think that in my personal life, what I have witnessed is that when I have experienced growth, it has been when I have been willing and able to have new experiences in some way. And that doesn't necessarily even mean going out in the world. It could very well even be a very internal experience. So I don't think that it's necessarily, like when I say having a variety of experiences, I don't necessarily mean that, well, in order to grow, you have to go out in the world and do this, that, and check all of these things off your list. I mean, that may be the case for some people, but that's not going to be everybody's answers. But I do think that even being willing to entertain and experience our own internal experiences, sorry I'm using that word so much, can be really instrumental, perhaps even inherently instrumental in some way to that growth. So I think this could be a very, very long conversation about how people grow, because the fact is that I think because there are different types of people, different things will stimulate growth, whether that growth is positive or negative in terms of actual benefit to the overall organism of the self in question or the community in question. And I think it is also getting back to the whole like positive versus negative growth. I think that also can be a very subjective thing, because that's going to depend on where you started from, and that's going to depend on sometimes the perspective of other people in their relation to you from where you started. And I feel like that was not at all very clear. So let's just do it like this. Say you've got two people who are, I mean, nobody's perfect, but both of these people are, relatively healthy, but probably have some degree of a little bit of attachment stuff, or a little bit of trauma stuff, or a little bit of this, or a little bit of that. Mr. Man. And, like just regular people just living their life. But neither one has a very severe toxicity of any kind or anything like that. You've just got two regular people. And when they meet and become friends, maybe there is a little bit of codependence. It doesn't rise to the level of toxicity, but there's just a little bit of codependence that exists in that relationship. And then one of those people goes on to do a lot of work around themselves, and they realize that they see that codependent behavior in some way, shape, or form show up in a lot of their relationships, and they don't really like that aspect of themselves. They feel like that hasn't served them well in some way, and so they do a lot of work around having boundaries and being firm but flexible with those boundaries and being direct, which subjectively that person would certainly experience and describe those changes in behavior as growth. But going back to that friendship, all of those sort of covert contracts that were in place initially now kind of have to be rewritten. And perhaps as a result, that friendship fails to thrive in the way that it had before. The emotional intimacy between those two people is lost. So from the perspective of this one person who, didn't change, didn't see anything that needed to be corrected in the relationship, from their perspective, even if they can see on some level that the other person did experience growth, their personal experience of the situation might not feel that growth was inherently positive. So, it's a really complex thing. And, consequently, here's another, or not consequently, but additionally, here's another example is, say you have two people and it is an abusive relationship, and the person who is abused grows in the way that they are more closed off and more wary and of other people, even after getting out of that relationship, they still carry the marks of that relationship with them. That is still growth. And even though that growth won't serve that person in the long run, it certainly served them well to get through that point. So I don't think it's even a question or a matter of whether people grow. I think people grow all of the time. I think we grow in ways large and small, subjectively negative or positive, in many ways. I think it is, especially in this modern world, I think it is harder to not change and grow in some way. But again, that doesn't mean that said change or growth is always going to be beneficial. There are plenty of people out there in the world who maybe didn't used to have, I'm just going to take an issue that's personal to my life. Maybe I think there are a lot of people here in America anyways who really didn't used to give a care one way or another about trans people. They recognized that they were people. They recognized there weren't very many of them. They didn't really understand it, but they didn't really have a whole lot of thought on it one way. It's one way or another. It's such a small percentage of the population that most people just didn't even think of it at all. But now we are in a place where, largely due to misinformation and fear and a lack of familiarity, we are now in a place where there are many people out there who would be more than happy for trans people to be forced to not be around anymore. So while that's change and that's growth, I personally see that more as like a cancerous growth. It's an unfortunate growth that doesn't help. Having all of that fear and hatred of other people certainly doesn't help the person who is holding that fear or the person who's the recipient of the hatred. So I think that it is, Mr. Man, for reals, man, you don't always get to be the center of attention, okay? I mean, I'll let you stay here for a minute. I had to restart this video like 5 times because he just kept coming up and mugging right in the front of it, and it was so distracting to me. But I feel like I've gotten through most of what I wanted to say this first time around. I suspect that, as with most things, that this is probably something that I'll continue to think on a little bit. But wait, did I get through everything I wanted to say? I didn't take any notes, which in retrospect was silly. I didn't say everything I wanted to say. There was one other major point that I wanted to make. Mr. Man, your cuteness is distracting. You must go. There was one other thing that I wanted to say, and it is this. I think, again, that it is obvious that people grow, so I think we can dispel with the whether people grow question. I think how people grow, again, with this sort of expanded understanding of what the word grow means, I think how people grow is a natural response to the experiences internally and externally that they have. I think this sort of next question in my mind is, how can we tailor the growth to be most beneficial to our own health and the health of the people that we engage with? And I think that is really more of a process of pruning. I think the growth is inevitable. I think how the growth happens is through experience, and I think the larger question, I know I'm just repeating myself, but it helps me. The larger question is, how do we prune that growth to our own best advantage? And I think, again, this is probably just me sort of inflicting my own frame of reference on other people, so take what resonates, leave the rest. But I think the first part is in sort of looking at yourself and your relationships, both, again, internally and externally, with places and concepts and things, looking at those sorts of parts of your life as objectively as you can, and recognizing where what growth you have is maybe not the most positive. Maybe there's some sort of pruning or staking or some other gardening task that needs to be done. And, you know, so for real, that is, you know, looking at our own traumas. You know, a lot of times there is a huge opportunity for really positive growth by being honest with ourselves about our own experiences and traumas. And everybody has traumas. Not everybody has what we used to think of as traumas, you know, but I think that as we've gotten a better understanding of how trauma impacts the brain and the physiology of us humans, we've really started to also get a better understanding of how common it is for us to experience trauma. And that that doesn't leave us nothing to work with. That leaves us a lot to work with. But, you know, we have to start from a place of acknowledging where our growth could be more ideal and doing that in a way where we are kind and gentle with ourselves. You know, there's a reason I end every video with that. You know, I think it's a really important thing to remember to do, and it's something that I think a lot of us often forget. So it's important to remember that, you know, before, again, it's just so helpful to always use gardens and plants as just a way of explaining what I want to explain. But if you imagine that you have a house plant, you just have a tiny little house plant, but the container that it's in, it's cracked, maybe you overwatered it for too long, and so it got a little bit of root rot in there, so part of it's starting to look a little just not happy. Obviously, you want to remove as many of the negative impacts on that plant as you can, and you want to instead try and surround it with good soil and a healthy place to be. And when you're moving it from one place to another, you're not just going to slap it around and throw it on the ground. You're going to be gentle with it. And I think that if we can hold ourselves with that level of gentleness, while not, what's the word I'm looking for? While not, if we can hold ourselves with that gentleness while not losing sight of our objective truth with ourselves, I think that can be a really good starting place for growth. I think that how we go through the process of trying to more objectively look at ourselves is, and again, everybody's frame of reference is going to be a little bit different, I'm sure. But, you know, we need to decide for ourselves what is most important. And for many people, I think that that will end up being relationships. Maybe relationships with a spouse, maybe with children or parents or other family members or friends or animals or trees and plants, you know, but they're still relationships. And I think it's important to, you know, sort of decide what metrics we want to look at in ourselves that we feel would make us more successful as human beings. And also, I think that there is certainly an aspect of deciding on what that success even means, because that is going to vary person in person. So once we know what success means, and we know by what metrics we want to measure said success, then we can have an honest look about where we are in relationship to where we'd like to be. And that's a place to start. I mean, if growth and change is going to happen no matter what, obviously you can't make yourself perfect. I think it's based on different personality types, it's probably not likely that anyone on their own would be able to master all of the things that every human would think of as being successful. So I think there is going to be some discernment in this process for each of us. And, you know, we all get to make our decisions about how we live our own life and what we place importance on. And that might be part of the growth process too, is in discovering that for yourself. I think a lot of this, and again, probably just inserting my own frame of reference, but I think a lot of this process starts with some openness and willingness to have some deep inquiry with yourself and where you are and where you'd like to be. And that is a pretty big task right there. But I think just right there, it inspires growth, you know, because like you're setting the stage and sort of creating your intentions, which just kind of opens the door for you to be more focused and tailored about how you move forward. Yeah, I think that's it for now. Like I said, I'll probably have more thoughts on this. I don't know. Let me know what you think of the topic. And thank you, Eric, so much for the suggestion. If any of y'all have things you want me to talk about, please send them my way, because sometimes that is a real struggle. So much appreciate each and every one of you. Please do leave a thumbs up and consider subscribing, especially if you're still here. Please do leave a thumbs up. And let's see what else. Oh, if you want a tarot reading, the information will be in the description box below. And check out my Etsy page. I have neat things over there. Aside of that, as always, don't forget to be kind and gentle with yourself, and I will see you soon. Crinkle, crinkle. It's always this way. So many false starts, and then once I get past pert and point,